welcome back to Pursuing Justice. I'm Harriet Handel. Today, we continue our theme of reentry. We heard from Barbara Richards, who started Project 180 in Sarasota, Florida. And today, we have John Eldon, who started AFTER INNOCence, also a nonprofit organization. John is going to tell us about his group, which serves 48 states. We can sum up AFTER INNOCence by saying it is post-release justice for Americans who have been wrongfully convicted and sent to prison. This project is a member of the Innocence Network, a huge consortium of innocence projects all over the world and, of course, in the United States. AFTER INNOCence is based in Oakland, California. It's good to have you with us, John. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right. What I'd like my listeners to understand is what motivated you as a lawyer to start AFTER INNOCence. And if you would define the problem of what happens after someone who has been wrongfully incarcerated leaves prison.
So, not long after I started practicing law about 20 years ago, I was looking for pro bono work and was drawn, as many are, to wrongful conviction, the horrifying injustice of being arrested, charged, tried, convicted for something that you did not do, I think resonates with many and certainly with me. And in thinking about how I might be involved as a young lawyer working in corporate law right out of law school, I struggled to see a place until I went and saw. And when you go and see, you learn. And I went and saw and met a person who was wrongfully convicted in California, not far from where I lived, and soon discovered not only that the vast majority of people who emerge from wrongful conviction don't have any reentry support at all. And also saw that there were some hopeful places to put some effort. And so that's sort of how I got started. I was deeply moved by the tragedy and horror that these people went through. I saw it as not only something that was about them, but was about us, because we convict them in the name of the people. This is our system. These are our courts. These are our prisons. This is something that is done in our name. And once we identify a particular error, part of being accountable is to pay attention to what we learn, which we don't do, what we could learn, and also to pay attention to how these people are treated after they get out. So that's how I started. It was about 15 years ago, I guess, and really saw up front by meeting some exonerees and talking to some people involved in the work, just how these people were essentially pushed out the door and the system turns its back on them. And so that's how I became interested and drawn to this. The way I got started in the work was to start a small sort of informal pro bono project out of that law firm, with the idea, hey, I'm a lawyer, maybe I can help these people with some post-release legal problems. It became obvious pretty quickly that it was the kind of thing that I was going to get a lot more done finding other lawyers in other places with specific skill sets to do the work than it would be if I tried to do work myself, which would be limited to where I live and really limited to what I could competently do as a young attorney. And that really turned me on to doing this work. I met a lot of exonerees. I met a lot of people in the movement, and I saw just how much there was to do. And the projects were all nothing more than calling someone up and saying, whether they were out of prison for a day or a year or several years, hey, do you need a lawyer's help with something? And it could be a family law problem or a tax problem or a record expungement problem, whatever it was, I would agree to try and place the case. And with a very high likelihood of doing so. A couple of years ago, we determined that our current placement rate is well over 90% for these kinds of cases. And it turns out that lawyers, even lawyers that I would cold call across the country and ask to take cases, were very interested and willing to do so. And so that's how the project sort of started, I suppose. And I started doing that work for, in again, about 2004, 2005. And did it informally for several years, and then got involved in completely different work, left corporate law, and around 2012, 13, came back to this work. And what brought me back to it was the National Registry of Exonerations had been launched. It was for the first time a careful, serious place where on an ongoing basis we could understand, the scope of the exoneree population across the country. And also the fact that those many years later, there was still no widespread effort to actually deliver serious assistance to this population. And so I started After Innocence to do something about that.
That's terrific. What a great story. You mentioned to me when we spoke earlier, before the podcast, that this problem of adjustment to society continues possibly for decades. And it's more than adjustment to society. It has many, many parts to it, many components, I guess I would say. As someone who's been part of the Innocence Project of Florida for 11 years and on the board for 6, even I was unaware of these hurdles so long after someone gets out of prison. So if you could enlighten us about that particular area. And I read an article about your group. I'm not sure where I read it in doing, a little prep for the interview today. And you ask exonerees, what is your greatest need? Is that how you approach a new client? So there are a couple questions in that
let me
for you to answer. Go ahead.
Yeah. Let me take a step back, and this will be
sure.
I'm sure that gets edited out. The article you read was unfortunately a complete misunderstanding. And as you know from our call the other day, this is a very focused, very specific project. And we try really hard to be very clear about what we do and not overpromise. So we wouldn't ask a question, what is your greatest need? And I don't know where that came from. It certainly didn't come from my mouth. So let me get back. Let me take a step back and talk about, I think what the first part of your question was aimed at. So your listeners are no doubt aware of wrongful conviction. And if we as a population are aware of wrongful conviction, we can ask, how do we know? And the way we know in individual stories and cases is typically about people who've been released. And what surprises people is that they get very little help when they get out. What also surprises people is that they're not all entitled to millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. What also surprises people is that the organizations, the wonderful, hardworking organizations across the country, my colleague organizations in the Innocence Network, law clinics, independent nonprofits, and then separate from that, conviction integrity units, those are all major contributors to exoneration in the United States. But there are many, many, many exonerees in America, more than half of them, who don't even have those organizations to turn to when it comes to post-release assistance. So what we have set up to begin with is a bunch of people getting out of prison who don't get, sort of fall through the cracks, and they don't get services that are designed for reentry for a variety of reasons, administrative mostly. They're keyed to probation and parole. These people are not on probation and parole. Also, some of them get significant money eventually, but most of them do not. And third, they don't have connections to organizations. And so take those three things together, it's not going to be a surprise that you find that reentry as a thing, reacclimatizing yourself as a thing, it does not end in the first month or the first year or 2 years later. True enough, most of them find their way. They find a place to live, they find some work, but if we view reentry as becoming well adjusted and having some assistance in rebuilding their lives, the majority never got it and continued to not get it. And so one of the ways that After Innocence is very different from most reentry organizations is that we are not solely focused on the first month or year or couple of years out of prison. And it's totally understandable why our publicly funded structures do that. It makes a lot of sense to help somebody right when they get home. But the way I look at it, if we as a society are going to take seriously the fact that we've dumped these exonerees out on the street for decades now without any help, and we're going to now try and do something about it, it really is incumbent upon us to look at that population as a whole and try and serve everyone, as tall as that order may be. Because otherwise, we're turning our backs on the people who got out 5 years ago or 10 years ago or even 20 years ago and saying, well, I guess tough for you, you got out too early. Or to make the mistaken assumption that since you got out that long ago, you must not need our help. The opposite is true. We find that there is almost no difference in the likelihood that someone needs help from us in the specific areas we work in does not correlate to how long they've been out of prison. And so, nor does it correlate, frankly, to how much money they're now making or whether they got, a civil recovery in connection with their wrongful conviction. Very clear immediately in doing this work that it would be useful to a great number of them and a wonderful resource to provide. And so the business is really, how do we get a limited set of very skilled, very serious assistants to as many of them as possible, as quickly as possible, irrespective of whether they've been out of prison for a day or decades. And that is the project.
I see. Oh, that's a great summary of, your mission, so to speak. Your reach is huge. Several hundred exonerees across 48 states. How can you help so many, and how do you help so many?
So if the goal is, the question or the challenge of this project is to say, what can we do that is serious and rigorous and helpful and that we can maintain for a huge number of people? This is the way that I and this organization have answered this question. So I would say, as an example for your listeners, if Harriet, you had just been released from prison, or if I had tracked you down and found you as having been released from prison after wrongful conviction 5, 10, 15, or 20 years ago, the call would be different, not by very much. I mean, if you'd been released very recently, we'd be talking about initial things like getting you set up with photo ID, in this moment, stimulus payments and other kinds of things, a little more heavily on the administrative first steps. But let's say you've been out for a while, and I'd call you up and I'd say, this is what we do. We are a nonprofit. Everything we do is free, and we are here to support people who've been wrongfully convicted anywhere in this country. And the way we do that is by offering a limited but very serious set of offerings. And they generally fall into 3 areas. And the first one is healthcare, and the second is legal services, and the third is social service connections. And so why those 3 things? Because those are 3 things that we have a lot of expertise in and that we know we can do ourselves start to finish, not send you off to another organization somewhere in the country that we don't know much about and can't vouch for, not send you off to some website and assume that because we gave you information, we gave you help. So we're really focused on an intervention that offers a lot of very intensive work with you in a few key areas. So what does that actually look like? Well, we'd start with healthcare, and we would make sure, hearing about your situation, that you are getting the healthcare you are eligible for. And that means it could be anything from you're getting the Medicaid that you're eligible for, or you have access to a policy through the Obamacare marketplace for people who have to buy healthcare on their own, or you're Medicare aged and you're enrolled properly. Once we determine eligibility and enrollment,